Well, thank you, Chair, for giving us the opportunity to speak to this committee today. Just before we begin, I'd like to note that while being a regional councillor representing North East Christchurch, the views expressed today are not necessarily those of ECAN and are those of my own and of Brendon's. So far in the general election campaign, the major parties have both pledged between $300 and $400 million for Canterbury transport projects. Hopefully there'll be more. Perhaps with some more op-eds from Chair Scott it may come, but we know also how much they've pledged for the Auckland region and the Greater Wellington region, and it's in the tens of billions of dollars. Today what we're suggesting and what we're advocating for is free. We're not asking you to greenlight multi-billion dollar passenger rail projects, but what we're doing is asking for the protection of Greater Christchurch's rail corridors through regional spatial planning so that future leaders and generations have the capacity to develop innovative urban form. This will enable Greater Christchurch to become less like Auckland and Los Angeles with our forecast growth and more like Copenhagen and other cities and authorities that had the foresight to plan ahead for their future. If we don't get this right now, then the cost to remedy poor urban form and hyper car use in the future will be exponentially greater than it is now. Next slide. So my main involvement with this initiative and deputation has been in the design of the maps that we're presenting today, and Brendon will provide our request and the rationale behind the request. So in introducing Brendon Harre, he's a resident of Christchurch and has been a strong advocate for the region. He works as a registered nurse in Hillmorton Hospital. His interests include writing about urbanism, affordable housing and multimodal transport solutions. For over 10 years he has written articles both for social media and mainstream media. Brendon has participated voluntarily in an urban land markets group of about a dozen policy experts that provided advice to the Ministry of the Environment about resource management reforms. This group produced several cabinet papers such as A New Approach to Urban Planning, which detailed the importance of spatial planning, and the paper How We Supply Infrastructure Makes Housing Unaffordable. Those papers can be accessed through the Economic Policy Centre of Auckland University's Business School.
Okay, thank you all. This presentation is in two parts. The first part gets straight to the point and outlines what we want. The second part provides the rationale. So firstly, we'd like a land corridor to be designated so that double-tracked electrified rail is future protected in the following areas. The 32 kilometres from Rolleston to Littleton, the 30 kilometres from Rangiora to Addington where it joins the Rolleston line, and the 17 kilometres from Lincoln to Hornby where it also joins the Rolleston line. This Lincoln line includes a short existing spur from Hornby to near the Southern Motorway. From there to Lincoln, a paper railway line would need to be designated on a route something like what we've depicted. In total, we would like about 79 kilometres of rail lines protected. We would also like a third main line designated for freight from the inland port near Rolleston to Littleton. Further, we would like a zone corridor that extends 1 kilometre on either side of these railway lines, protected from low density sprawl. Within this wider corridor, we would like zoning indicating a minimum of 60 housing units per hectare. See the slide for the indication of what sort of built environment that implies. This zoning would be contingent on if and when passenger rail infrastructure is provided. In the meantime, the corridor would be protected from being developed over. Secondly, that around any future railway stations, the public right-of-ways provide plentiful walkable and active mode access to the station. This can be achieved with various urban planning rules, such as having a minimum of 100 intersections per square kilometre and having small block sizes. Obviously, within Christchurch's existing urban footprint, like for the proposed mass rapid transit urban growth corridor, these stipulations would be aspirational, because although there are planning mechanisms that can enable densification, how much and when to densify is decided by existing households and property owners, not councils or governments. But for the greenfield areas in the protected corridors, these stipulations could be strictly enforced. The rationale. This presentation is not about arguing for specific rail transport projects or specific higher density developments. These should all be investigated on a case-by-case basis as required. Our request is about protecting these options for the future. We will be making the same case through the Greater Christchurch Spatial Plan submission process. Interestingly, we had a discussion about electric battery trains just earlier ago. 95 years ago, you could catch an electric battery train from Morehouse Ave to Lincoln and around to Little River. It took under 25 minutes to get to Lincoln. Unfortunately, New Zealand Rail chose not to invest in this passenger rail technology or any alternative improvement. Instead, Canterbury's rail network was put into managed decline. We think this was a mistake. This mistake did not happen to the Wellington region, and despite its population being more spread out, that region has higher public transport patronage, lower motor vehicle mode use, and a much better emission profile than Canterbury. The same mistake was though made in Auckland, but it has since been rectified. It is our strong opinion the option to fix this mistake for Greater Christchurch needs to be kept open. Our request is complementary to the proposed 22-kilometre long MRT transport project in the surrounding primary urban growth corridor. Passenger rail on the existing rail corridor can feed into the proposed MRT line at Riccarton and Papanui, thus providing a more comprehensive public transport network. In particular, MRT project provides a high-frequency city centre connection for the railway. Another complementary advantage is if housing development on the primary growth corridor becomes constrained, then the protected areas around the wider railway network can then be used to provide secondary urban growth corridors. MRT infrastructure may be more successful than we anticipate. Once the initial MRT corridor is built, there might be high demand for further corridors. It's notable that when Copenhagen was about the size of Greater Christchurch in 1947, it developed the finger plan, which you can see up there, as its spatial strategy. This required protecting 170 kilometres for double tracking and future urban growth. Obviously, this is far greater than Christchurch's proposed 22-kilometre MRT corridor. The future is uncertain. At the moment, when the major political parties are only promising hundreds of millions for Canterbury to get a bridge and a bypass, then expansionary rail plans may seem forever out of reach. But future government priorities can change, so we should do the work needed to prepare for that change. Unanticipated events do occur. Christchurch, because of the earthquakes, built at a density of 15 houses per hectare in places like Longhurst and Horswell, rather than 60 houses per hectare along MRT corridors, partly because these plans were not in place. Global warming and New Zealand's shaky tectonic location mean that unanticipated destructive and movement of people events are always a possibility. We think keeping our options open is the most sensible approach to this uncertain future. Our slide highlights the earthquake risk because that is fresh in our memories. but climate change may be the greater risk for increasing the movement of people. Science author Gaia Vince explains in her book Nomad Century that billions of people will need to move due to climate change. Fire, heat, drought and floods will drive them out. Less affected places, probably like New Zealand and Canterbury, may need to make room for these climate-induced migration. Yeah, thanks for listening to our presentation. I hope you give the discussed request serious consideration.
Thank you for the thought you put into this. Obviously, future-proofing those things is important as we go down this track. So, Mayors, have you got questions or clarity? Sam?
Yeah, you mentioned that we're going to present to the Greater Christchurch Spatial Planning work. Is that, I just want to confirm that's where that's happening, because it feels like this is so centred on that and land use particularly, as well as the transport piece, which is not necessarily, we hear quite transport focused, so just making sure it's covered.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Put the resolution